The people of Maplewood would never forget this day. The town, once quiet and unremarkable, became the center of a case so disturbing that it left even seasoned investigators shaken. It all began when an 18-year-old girl arrived at the hospital in labor, cradling a newborn she never should have had. When the nurses gently asked who the father was, her hesitant answer sent chills through the room. A single name was spoken, one that should have never been mentioned in this context. But what led to this horrifying truth? How had something so sinister remained hidden for years? Keep watching as we dive deeper into the shocking case of the Eldridge family, where silence, fear, and neglect allowed an unimaginable crime to unfold behind closed doors. The town of Maplewood, Oklahoma, had always been a place where people felt safe, where neighbors greeted each other in the mornings, and where crimes rarely went beyond minor thefts or the occasional bar fight. It was the kind of town where children played freely on the streets, where the biggest events were local high school football games, and where everyone knew each other by name. But all of that changed on the summer afternoon of July 24, 2017, when an ambulance pulled into the emergency entrance of Maplewood General Hospital, carrying an 18-year-old girl whose frail body and empty eyes told a story that no one was prepared to hear. She was barely able to speak, her hands trembling as she clutched a newborn baby against her chest. The medical staff, accustomed to teenage pregnancies, expected to see a frightened young mother, but what they found was something much darker. She seemed disconnected from reality, her expression blank, as if she didn't fully understand what had happened to her. She did not cry, she did not ask for help, and when a nurse gently asked who the father of the child was, she hesitated. Her eyes flickered toward her mother, who stood nearby, tense and motionless. The silence in the room thickened as the girl lowered her gaze, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the hospital blanket. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke a name that sent a shockwave through the staff. The room fell silent. The nurse's hands froze. A doctor, busy reviewing the charts, looked up with sudden alarm. Something was wrong. Deeply, disturbingly wrong. Within minutes, the hospital staff made a call that would unravel a horrifying truth. The nurse, who had heard the girl's answer, knew that something had to be done immediately. A DNA test was ordered without hesitation, and security was quietly alerted to ensure that the girl remained in the hospital under supervision. The medical team had seen many tragic cases, but nothing could have prepared them for the results that would soon come back. This was not a simple case of an unplanned pregnancy. This was something far worse. Something that would soon expose a hidden nightmare buried within the walls of a seemingly ordinary home. As the doctors and nurses worked in tense silence, their thoughts raced. They had seen abuse before, had treated victims of domestic violence and neglect, but there was something unsettling about the way this young girl responded to questions. She showed no typical signs of a teenage mother who had made a mistake or who had been taken advantage of by a peer. Instead, she seemed lost in a world where she had never been taught what was right or wrong, as if she had lived her entire life under a set of rules completely different from the rest of the world. She did not flinch at the weight of what she had just revealed. She did not ask for her child to be taken away, nor did she beg to hold it closer. It was as if she had never been given the ability to choose anything for herself. The medical staff exchanged glances, silently reaching the same conclusion. This was not just another case of teenage pregnancy. Something far darker had been happening, and it had been happening for a long time. The signs were there, hidden beneath her gaunt frame and hollow eyes, in the way she barely reacted to the world around her. Someone had controlled her. Someone had taken everything from her, and now, with the birth of her child, the truth had slipped through the cracks of the carefully maintained illusion that had surrounded her for years. The hospital's administration wasted no time contacting the Oklahoma Department of Human Services. Within an hour, a caseworker was dispatched, arriving at the hospital with a notebook and a determined expression. As the investigation began, the girl was questioned again, this time by someone trained to recognize the signs of abuse. But her responses remained vague, uncertain. When asked if the baby's father was someone she loved, she looked confused. When asked how long the relationship had been going on, she could not answer. She could not describe how it had started. She could not explain why she had never told anyone. The questions became more precise, but the answers remained unsettlingly unclear. It was not that she was hiding something. It was that she did not seem to fully understand what had been done to her. When her mother was questioned, her responses were even more troubling. She spoke in a rushed, defensive manner, her eyes darting around as she claimed that her daughter had always been different, that she had always been quiet, that she simply did not understand things the way other girls her age did. She insisted that there was no reason to investigate further, that everything was fine, that her daughter had a boyfriend, though she could not provide a name or any details about him. When asked why she had not sought medical care for her daughter throughout the pregnancy, she brushed off the concern, claiming they had intended to handle it on their own. But the officials were not convinced. The inconsistencies were too glaring, the mother's responses too rehearsed. The DNA test was expedited, samples taken from the young mother, the newborn, and every male in the household. The results were expected to take several days, but the moment they arrived, any lingering doubt vanished. The numbers, the undeniable biological markers, the horrifying confirmation, it was worse than anyone had imagined. The father of the child was not a boyfriend, not a stranger, not some unknown predator lurking in the shadows. The father of the child was her own brother. With this revelation, everything changed. The call was made to law enforcement and an arrest warrant was issued immediately. Police officers were dispatched to the girl's home, a modest, single-story house on a quiet street, a place that had never drawn suspicion, a place that blended in seamlessly with the rest of the neighborhood. The officers moved quickly, arriving before dawn, catching the family off guard. As they pounded on the door, a woman inside froze. She had been expecting this moment. She had known since the DNA test had been ordered that there was no escape. The truth, buried for years, had finally surfaced. The knock came again, louder this time. A voice announced their presence. Inside the house, a young man stirred in his bed, unaware that his world was seconds away from collapsing. His mother hesitated, glancing down the hallway, as if hoping she could make it all go away. But there was no more hiding. The walls that had shielded their secret were about to come crumbling down. The Eldridge family lived in a small, unassuming house on the outskirts of Maplewood, Oklahoma. To their neighbors, they were quiet but ordinary, blending seamlessly into the fabric of the town. The father, Richard Eldridge, was a construction worker, known for his strict demeanor and unwavering authority. He left for work before dawn and returned home late, his presence in the house more of a shadow than a warmth. His wife, Linda, was a woman who spoke little and moved through life with an air of quiet submission. She was the type of person who avoided eye contact, who never lingered in conversation, and who always seemed to be waiting for something, though no one knew what. Their son, Thomas, was 19 years old, a high school dropout who had long since fallen away from the expectations of his peers. He had a reputation for being unpredictable, with a temper that flared in moments of frustration and a tendency to manipulate those around him. But the heart of the Eldridge home was not in the father, the mother, or the son. It was in their daughter, Abigail, an 18-year-old girl whose presence in the town had been little more than a whisper. Abigail had always been different. Born with an intellectual disability, she saw the world through a lens far removed from those around her. Her understanding of social cues was limited, her ability to grasp the weight of certain situations stunted by the way her mind worked. She lived in a structured world, one dictated by rules she did not create but was expected to follow. Her interactions with others were brief, confined mostly to her teachers, who noticed the way she struggled to communicate, the way she hesitated before answering even the simplest of questions. There had always been something guarded about her, something uncertain, but no one had ever known just how deep that uncertainty ran. For years, the Eldridge home had been a fortress of secrecy, its walls holding truths that no one outside of its confines could see. The curtains were always drawn, the windows covered, and visitors were rare. The family kept to themselves, and while this may have seemed odd in a town as small as Maplewood, it was not enough to raise suspicion. People minded their own business, respecting the privacy that the Eldridges seemed to demand. They had no close friends, no extended family that ever came to visit, no signs of trouble beyond the occasional argument heard through thin walls, and yet there had been signs that in hindsight should have been impossible to ignore. The first whispers of something being wrong had come from the school. Abigail had always been quiet, but over time, her behavior changed. She became more withdrawn, flinching at sudden movements, hesitating before speaking. Teachers noticed bruises on her arms, marks she could not explain, wounds that she dismissed with a nervous laugh or an uncertain glance toward the floor. A counselor filed a report citing concerns about possible abuse, but when Child Protective Services arrived at the Eldridge home, they were met with a mother who smiled too much and a father who spoke too little. Linda assured them that Abigail was simply clumsy, that she had always been prone to falling, that she had never once been harmed in that house. Richard stood beside her, silent and imposing, his presence alone enough to dissuade further question. The case was closed, the concerns brushed aside, and Abigail remained exactly where she had always been, trapped within the walls of a home where no one was coming to save her. What no one had known at the time was that the true source of Abigail's suffering was not only her father's cruelty or her mother's silence, it was Thomas, her own brother. A boy who had grown into a man with a dangerous need for control, a desire to manipulate, to dominate, to take. He saw Abigail not as a sister, but as something that belonged to him, someone who could not fight back, who could not say no, who could not escape. He had started slowly, testing boundaries, pushing limits, seeing how far he could go before anyone noticed. And when no one did, he went further. For 2 years, the abuse had continued in silence. Richard had known. He had caught them once, had seen something that should have stopped everything. But instead of protecting his daughter, he had turned his rage on both of them. He had beaten them, not out of anger for what had happened, but out of the belief that Abigail was just as guilty as her brother, that she had somehow invited it, encouraged it. And so, instead of stopping the horror, he let it continue. Linda had known too. She had heard the sounds at night, had seen the way Abigail shrank away from Thomas, had watched her daughter become less and less of a person with each passing day. But she had done nothing. She had looked away, had convinced herself that it wasn't her place to intervene, that it was better to pretend nothing was happening than to risk what would come if she acknowledged the truth. Then, something happened that no one in the Eldridge home could hide. Abigail became pregnant. Her body changed, her stomach swelled, and for the first time, the reality of what had been happening could no longer be ignored. But instead of seeking help, instead of breaking the cycle, the family made a decision. They would hide it. They would tell no one. They would make sure that when the baby came, it would be dealt with in a way that would keep their secret buried. Abigail, confused and unaware, did not even understand what was happening to her. She did not know why her body was changing, did not fully grasp the weight of what it meant, and the people who should have protected her did not explain it to her. They told her to say nothing. They told her that if anyone asked, she had to lie. They thought they could keep it quiet. They thought they could control the outcome. But then the baby arrived, and with it, the truth that they had tried so hard to conceal. Abigail, lying in a hospital bed, surrounded by doctors and nurses, was asked a simple question. A question that should have had a simple answer. But when she hesitated, when she glanced toward her mother, when she whispered a name that should have never been spoken, the room froze, the silence stretched, the weight of realization settling over everyone present. A nurse left without a word, a phone call was made, and in that instant, the Eldridge family's carefully constructed illusion came crashing down. Authorities were contacted immediately, and an emergency DNA test was ordered. The results, when they arrived, shattered whatever thin veneer of doubt still remained. The father of Abigail's baby was not a stranger, not a nameless predator lurking in the shadows. It was Thomas, her own brother, and the home that had concealed so much horror for so long was now at the center of an investigation that would shake the town to its core. The Eldridge family, once just another quiet household in a quiet town, was about to become a name that would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. For years, the Eldridge family functioned under a shared silence, an unspoken agreement to ignore what should have never been allowed to happen. It was a household where the truth was not just hidden, but deliberately buried, where the people who should have been protectors instead became enablers, where the walls held whispers that no one dared to acknowledge. Every member of the family played a role in maintaining this facade, each of them complicit in their own way, whether through action or through absence. It was not a single failure, but a series of choices made day after day that allowed the nightmare to continue unchecked. Richard Eldridge was the foundation of this secrecy. A man of rigid discipline, he had built his household on the belief that authority was absolute and that his word was final. He did not tolerate disobedience, nor did he entertain the idea of weakness. His daughter's disability was something he saw as an inconvenience, a flaw that he had long since stopped trying to understand. In his mind, she was nothing more than a burden to be controlled, another problem in a life that had never granted him ease. When he first realized what was happening between his children, he had been given a choice. He could have intervened, could have stopped the horror before it escalated, but instead, he did what he had always done. He enforced silence. He did not view Abigail as a victim, nor did he see his son as a predator. To him, both were guilty of something unspoken, something shameful, something that should never be spoken of again. He punished them both and then allowed the cycle to continue. Linda Eldridge, on the other hand, was not a woman of authority, but one of passivity. She had spent her marriage living in the shadows of her husband's expectations, shaping herself into whatever version of a wife would keep the peace. She did not argue, did not challenge, did not fight back. And when it became clear that something horrific was happening within her own home, she made the same choice she had always made. She looked away. She saw the bruises on Abigail's arms, noticed the way she shrank away from Thomas, witnessed the way her daughter's once limited confidence had completely dissolved into silence. And yet she did nothing. She told herself that it was not her place to interfere, that perhaps she was imagining things, that as long as she didn't acknowledge it, it wasn't real. When Abigail became pregnant, Linda knew there would be no hiding the truth much longer, but even then, she did not act. She did not protect her daughter, nor did she seek justice. Instead, she did what she had always done. She obeyed. She listened when her husband told her they would handle it. She stood by as Thomas walked freely through their home. And she reassured Abigail over and over again that it was better this way, that no one needed to know. Thomas Eldridge was the reason the nightmare existed in the first place. He had learned from a young age that control was power, that manipulation could get him anything he wanted, that as long as he moved carefully enough, no one would stop him. He had always been a boy who pushed limits, who tested boundaries, who reveled in the knowledge that he could bend the world to his will. His relationship with his sister had begun as a twisted game, a cruel experiment in seeing how far he could go before anyone noticed. And when no one did, he took everything. He knew that Abigail did not understand what was happening, that her mind processed the world differently, that she did not have the capacity to resist. And he knew that his parents, whether out of fear or indifference, would not stop him. He moved through the house without consequence, knowing that there would be no punishment beyond a glance, no justice beyond his father's cold and distant disappointment. When Abigail became pregnant, he did not feel guilt, nor did he feel fear. He believed, just as his father had taught him, that the truth could be controlled, that as long as no one spoke it out loud, it did not exist. The town of Maplewood, though unknowingly distant, had also played a role in Abigail's suffering. It was a community where privacy was valued over intrusion, where people did not ask questions when things seemed off, where the whispers of concern were rarely followed by action. Neighbors had heard shouting through the walls, had seen the way Abigail's presence in public diminished over time, had noticed the changes in her behavior. Teachers had watched as she withdrew further into herself, as bruises appeared and faded without explanation, as her once timid but functioning engagement with the world turned into something else entirely. A school counselor had filed a report, and Child Protective Services had even visited the home once, but it had amounted to nothing. A conversation was had, reassurances were given, and the case was closed. The system that was supposed to catch these things, to prevent them, to protect the vulnerable, had failed. And so, for 2 years, the abuse continued in silence. Abigail, too innocent to fully grasp the horror of what was happening to her, had been trained to accept it. She did not understand that she could say no, that she could run, that there were people beyond her home who would believe her. She only understood what she had been taught, that she was to be quiet, that she was to obey, that she was to endure. When the pregnancy could no longer be hidden, she was instructed to lie. She was told to say nothing, to tell anyone who asked that she had a boyfriend, that it had been a secret but consensual relationship, that there was nothing to be concerned about, and she obeyed because that was all she had ever known how to do. The Eldridge family believed they could keep the secret buried, that as long as they controlled the story, no one would question it. They thought that once the baby was born, they could handle it, that they could find a way to make it disappear, to erase the evidence of what had happened. But their arrogance blinded them to the inevitable truth, that some things could not be hidden forever. That no matter how much they ignored it, no matter how much they convinced themselves that silence was protection, reality had a way of forcing itself to the surface. And when the moment came, when the truth finally slipped from Abigail's lips, there was no more room for denial. There was no more time to construct lies. The world they had built, the structure they had upheld for years, collapsed in an instant. The hospital staff, upon hearing Abigail's whispered confession, did not hesitate. A nurse left the room, a phone call was made, and within hours, the Eldridge home was no longer just another quiet house on an unremarkable street. It was a crime scene. DNA tests were ordered, investigators were dispatched, and for the first time in 2 years, someone was asking the right questions. Someone was looking closer. Someone was not turning away. The truth, long buried beneath layers of silence and complicity, was finally being dragged into the light, and for the Eldridge family, there was no escape. Their choices had led them to this moment, and now, for the first time, they would be forced to face the consequences. The moment Abigail Eldridge whispered the unthinkable, the fragile illusion that had sustained her family for years shattered. The nurses who had gathered around her hospital bed froze in stunned silence, their expressions shifting from concern to horror as they processed what they had just heard. It was a confession that should never have had to be made, an admission so vile that it defied comprehension. The weight of her words settled over the room, an invisible force that pressed down on everyone who heard them. And yet, as shocking as the truth was, there was no hesitation. A nurse quietly left the room, her hands trembling as she picked up the phone, and within minutes the wheels of justice had begun turning. There was no undoing what had been said. There was no reversing the inevitable. The Eldridge family's secrets were no longer theirs to keep. As the hospital staff moved with a newfound urgency, calls were made to the Oklahoma Department of Human Services. A caseworker was dispatched immediately, her arrival marking the beginning of an investigation that would unravel a horror far worse than anyone could have predicted. Abigail, barely comprehending the magnitude of what she had revealed, clutched the newborn in her arms, unaware that her entire world was about to change. The caseworker entered her room, her presence calm but unwavering, her questions careful but persistent. Abigail's responses were hesitant, uncertain, her mind struggling to form answers that had been conditioned out of her, but it was already too late for hesitation. The truth was coming, and there was no stopping it now. At the same time, law enforcement had been mobilized. Officers arrived at the Eldridge home before dawn, their presence turning what had once been a quiet suburban street into a scene of reckoning. Inside, Richard and Linda Eldridge had already sensed that something was wrong. Linda had spent the night pacing, staring out the window, checking her phone for a call that never came. Richard sat in his chair, silent, unreadable, his face a mask of cold calculation. He had always believed that he could control the narrative, that the things that happened within his home would stay there. He had underestimated just how quickly the world could shift beneath him. When the officers knocked on the door, the sound echoed through the house like a death knell. The stillness of the morning was broken by the sharp command to open up, and for the first time in years, silence was no longer an option. The front door swung open to reveal Linda, her face pale, her hands shaking at her sides. Behind her, Richard remained seated, his gaze locked onto the officers as if daring them to speak the words that would undo him, but they did not hesitate. Arrest warrants had been issued, and there was nothing left to discuss. Richard Eldridge, the man who had allowed the unthinkable to happen under his roof, was placed in handcuffs without resistance. Linda, his ever-compliant wife, followed moments later, her expression blank, as if her mind had already detached itself from reality. Their son Thomas was the last to be taken. Unlike his parents, he did not remain silent. He struggled, his protests growing louder as the officers restrained him. But his words meant nothing now. The evidence would speak for itself. Back at the hospital, Abigail remained in her room, shielded from the chaos unfolding beyond its walls. The DNA test had already been ordered, though there was no real need for confirmation. The truth had already been laid bare. The father of her child was not a stranger, not a boyfriend she had kept secret, not a mistake born of youthful recklessness. It was her own brother, the person who should have protected her, the person who had instead stolen everything from her. The caseworker sat beside her, notebook in hand, voice calm and measured, asking the questions that needed to be asked. Abigail struggled to answer, her mind a haze of confusion, fear, and years of conditioning that told her she was never meant to speak. But this time someone was listening. This time, someone would not turn away. As the news spread, the quiet town of Maplewood was consumed by disbelief. Neighbors who had once nodded politely to the Eldridges at the grocery store now whispered behind closed doors, horrified that something so monstrous had taken place in a house so ordinary. Teachers who had once dismissed their concerns about Abigail's withdrawn nature now questioned every choice they had made. The authorities who had visited the home years earlier, who had been reassured that everything was fine, now faced the realization that they had failed her in the worst way possible. The system, the very one meant to protect the vulnerable, had looked away when it mattered most. But now, there was no more looking away. The Eldridge family, once hidden behind a carefully crafted mask of normalcy, had been exposed for what they truly were. The justice system would decide their fate, but the damage had already been done. Abigail, for the first time in her life, was free from the house that had been her prison. But freedom came with its own burdens. She was left to navigate a world she had never truly been part of, to rebuild herself from the wreckage of what had been done to her. And though the arrests marked the end of one nightmare, they did not erase the years of silence that had allowed it to exist in the first place. The truth had finally come to light, but justice, true justice, would be far more complicated. The town of Maplewood had always been the kind of place where nothing truly terrible was supposed to happen, a town where neighbors knew each other by name, where families gathered for weekend barbecues, and where the biggest scandals usually revolved around local politics or high school rivalries. It was a place of predictability, a town that prided itself on its sense of community and safety. But when the truth about the Eldridge family came to light, everything changed. The illusion of normalcy shattered, leaving behind an overwhelming sense of betrayal and disbelief. The streets that had once felt familiar now carried an eerie weight, as if the town itself had been tainted by the horrors that had remained hidden for years. The realization that such evil had existed among them, that it had festered behind the walls of an unremarkable home on a quiet street, left Maplewood reeling in a way that no one could have anticipated. News of the arrests spread rapidly, first whispered among neighbors, then dominating local headlines, and soon making its way to national media outlets. Reporters descended upon the town, their presence a stark reminder that Maplewood was no longer just another small town in Oklahoma. Cameras captured footage of the Eldridge house, now a grim landmark of the town's darkest secret. The house itself stood as a silent testament to the years of suffering endured within its walls, its drawn curtains and lifeless appearance amplifying the horror of what had been uncovered. Residents who had once passed by without a second thought now looked upon it with a mixture of revulsion and guilt, unable to comprehend how such a monstrous reality had gone unnoticed for so long. The townspeople struggled to reconcile what they had learned with what they had believed about the Eldridges. Richard Eldridge had been a man of routine, known for his quiet demeanor and disciplined lifestyle. To most, he had seemed like an ordinary working-class father, a strict but steady presence in the community. His wife, Linda, had always been the more reserved one, the kind of woman who never drew attention to herself, who faded into the background of conversations, offering polite nods and empty smiles. Their son Thomas had been less known, a shadowy figure in the periphery of town life, dismissed by many as a troubled young man with no real direction. But no one had suspected that, behind closed doors, they had been capable of such monstrous acts. No one had imagined that within their household, an unspeakable nightmare had unfolded in silence for years. As details of the case emerged, shock turned to outrage. The community grappled with the uncomfortable truth that signs had been there all along, signs that had been ignored, overlooked, or dismissed. Teachers remembered the quiet girl who had sat in the back of their classrooms, withdrawn and hesitant to speak. Neighbors recalled the occasional shouting from the Eldridge home, the way Linda had always seemed tense, the way Abigail had seemed to shrink into herself whenever she was in the presence of her father or brother. A few even admitted to having had suspicions, fleeting thoughts that something wasn't quite right, yet no one had pushed further. No one had questioned enough. Now, faced with the undeniable horror of what had taken place, many found themselves haunted by a single unshakable question: could this have been stopped? Law enforcement officials, local social workers, and school administrators faced harsh scrutiny as the town demanded answers. There had been reports, however minor, that had been filed and forgotten. A concerned school counselor had once submitted a report about Abigail's unexplained bruises, but a single home visit had been enough to close the case. A neighbor had once called the police after hearing a disturbing argument late at night, but nothing had come of it. There had been opportunities to intervene, to prevent years of suffering, but time and time again the signs had been dismissed. Now, there was no undoing the past, no changing the fact that Abigail had endured unimaginable cruelty in a place that should have been her sanctuary. The aftermath of the revelations reached beyond just the Eldridge family. Parents in Maplewood began questioning how well they really knew their own neighbors, their own friends. Conversations that had once been lighthearted now carried an edge of unease. Trust, once taken for granted, had been fractured. The realization that such darkness had existed in their midst forced residents to reevaluate the things they had chosen to ignore, the moments when they had turned a blind eye to something that felt off, but had seemed easier to dismiss. The crime had not just scarred one girl, it had left an imprint on an entire community, a wound that would not easily heal. As the days turned into weeks, the legal proceedings began to take shape. The courthouse became a focal point of attention, a place where reporters camped outside, where residents gathered to catch glimpses of the accused as they were escorted in and out of hearings. The Eldridge name, once unremarkable, had become infamous. Richard and Linda Eldridge faced charges of child neglect and complicity in the abuse, their expressions hollow as they appeared before the judge. Thomas, the focal point of the investigation, remained in custody, facing charges so heinous that even hardened prosecutors struggled to speak of them without a sense of revulsion. The town, still in shock, found itself divided on how to process the horror that had come to define it. Some wanted justice to be swift and merciless, demanding the harshest possible sentences for those responsible. Others, particularly those who had known the family for years, struggled to make sense of the betrayal, unable to reconcile the people they had once seen as neighbors with the monsters they had proven to be. But the one thing everyone could agree on was that Maplewood would never be the same. The town had been changed, its innocence stripped away, its residents forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. Evil did not always announce itself. Sometimes it lived quietly behind white picket fences in houses that looked no different from their own. The aftermath of the Eldridge case sent shockwaves through the town of Maplewood, forever altering the community that had once prided itself on its safety and unity. What had been uncovered inside that home was more than a crime. It was a failure at every level. It was the failure of a family that had chosen to betray one of its own, the failure of neighbors who had ignored the warning signs, the failure of a system that had allowed it to continue for years. Now, as the legal process unfolded, there was no escaping the weight of what had happened. The courtroom became the center of a long and grueling trial. Prosecutors meticulously laid out the details of the abuse, using medical evidence, psychological reports, and testimonies from those who had encountered the family over the years. They revealed how Abigail had been trapped in an existence where she had no agency, no voice, and no understanding of the horrors inflicted upon her. DNA tests confirmed what had been suspected, solidifying the reality that her own brother had fathered the child she had never consented to having. The evidence against Richard Eldridge, the father who had failed to protect her, was damning. His search history, his dismissive attitude toward reports of abuse, his eventual participation in the crime, each revelation turned him into the embodiment of everything a father should never be. Linda Eldridge, the mother who had turned away, sat motionless as her complicity was exposed. Her silence, her refusal to act, her willingness to let her daughter suffer while maintaining the illusion of a normal household condemned her as much as those who had carried out the abuse. Thomas Eldridge, the son responsible for years of torment, was presented as both a predator and a manipulator. He had used his sister's innocence against her, taking advantage of her inability to comprehend what was happening. His behavior had escalated over time, and each moment of his calculated cruelty was dissected in court, showing the lengths to which he had gone to maintain control. His attempts to feign ignorance unraveled under the weight of the evidence. The jury listened as experts detailed how Abigail had been groomed, how she had been conditioned to accept the suffering imposed on her, how she had been deprived of a reality where she could seek help. Her voice had been silenced in that house, but now it was being heard. When the verdict came, it was swift and without mercy. Richard and Thomas Eldridge were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, their names forever tied to the unspeakable crimes they had committed. Linda, though not directly involved in the physical acts of abuse, was found guilty of child neglect and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. Their fates were sealed, and for the first time, they were forced to face the consequences of the horrors they had allowed to unfold within their home. The legal process had done what it could to bring justice, but there was no sentence severe enough to undo the damage inflicted upon Abigail. Outside the courtroom, the town of Maplewood struggled to come to terms with what had happened. Residents who had once trusted the Eldridge family now felt the weight of their own inaction. There were those who had heard whispers, those who had noticed bruises, those who had dismissed Abigail's withdrawn behavior as nothing more than the way she was. Teachers, neighbors, social workers, each person who had ever doubted their instincts now carried the guilt of wondering if they could have done more. The case had forced the town to confront the uncomfortable truth that monsters do not always lurk in the shadows. Sometimes they live among us, hidden in plain sight. Abigail, now free from the home that had once imprisoned her, faced an uncertain future. Placed in the care of professionals who specialized in trauma recovery, she struggled to navigate a world she had never been prepared for. She had never known safety, never understood love that wasn't conditioned by fear, never lived without the expectation that pain was inevitable. Every step forward was a challenge. The world outside the Eldridge home was foreign, filled with choices she had never been allowed to make. She hesitated before speaking, unsure if she was allowed to voice her own thoughts. She flinched at sudden movements, haunted by years of being unable to escape the presence of those who had hurt her. Therapy sessions were slow and painful, unraveling the layers of manipulation that had shaped her existence. The professionals working with her knew there were no easy solutions, no quick paths to recovery. What had been taken from her could never fully be restored. The child she had given birth to was placed in state custody, protected from the family that had brought him into existence under the worst circumstances imaginable. He was too young to understand what had happened, but one day he would ask questions. He would want to know who his parents were, why he had been taken away, why his origins carried the weight of something so unspeakable. Those who had taken him in knew the difficulty of the answers that would one day come. He was innocent, but the world around him would always know the story of how he came to be. As time passed, Maplewood worked to ensure that such a tragedy would never happen again. New policies were implemented to strengthen child protection services. Schools were given better resources to identify and report cases of suspected abuse. Community programs were introduced to educate residents on the importance of vigilance, of paying attention to signs that something might be wrong. The town had failed Abigail, but it would not fail another child. Her suffering had become the catalyst for change, and while it could never undo the past, it could serve as a warning for the future. The house where it had all happened remained vacant, a grim reminder of the darkness that had once festered within its walls. Some wanted it demolished, hoping to erase its existence from the town's landscape. Others believed it should remain standing, a symbol of the horrors that had been overlooked for too long. No matter what happened to the house, the memory of what had transpired inside it would never truly fade. The search for justice had ended with convictions, but the consequences of the Eldridge case would last a lifetime. The legal system had punished those responsible, but no punishment could ever truly fit the weight of their crimes. The community had learned a painful lesson, but lessons do not erase suffering. And for Abigail, justice was not a verdict. It was the long, uncertain road ahead, where she would have to redefine her life on her own terms, learning for the first time what it meant to live without fear.